Quetiapine also has its chemical structure related to clozapine and is antagonist at both 5-HT2A and D2 receptors. Interestingly, the net pharmacological action of quetiapine is actually due to the combined actions of quetiapine itself and its active metabolite, norquetiapine. Coming back to quetiapine, it is actually a very interesting agent since it acts like a different drug depending upon the dose and the formulation. Quetiapine comes in an immediate release as well as an extended release formulation. The IR formulation, as expected, has a relatively rapid onset and short duration of action. It's more sedating as its peak delivery is shortly after taking it, and is mostly due to its antihistaminic properties, thus making it an ideal hypnotic. At 300 mg per day, probably the lowest effective antipsychotic dose, the IR formulation rapidly occupies more than 60% of D2 receptors, sufficient for antipsychotic action, but then quickly falls below 60% of D2 receptor occupancy, thus requiring dosing more than once a day, or a very high dose to sustain adequate D2 receptor occupancy throughout the day. On the other hand, the XR formulation at the same dose slowly hits its peak, yet has a rapid enough onset of 60% D2 occupancy to be effective without the same amount of sedation. And its duration of action above the 60% threshold is for several hours. Even at the maximum dose of 800 mg as used in treatment-resistant cases, the IR formulation still occupies D2 receptors only for about 12 hours, above the required 60% threshold, risking breakthrough symptoms at the end of the day. On the other hand, XR maintains full effective D2 occupancy until the next day, 24 hours later. But then XR formulation is not ideal as an hypnotic because the peak is much delayed, and a good deal of residual drug is still present when the patient wakes up, increasing the chances of causing hangover effects.